Hello, and thank you for joining me for this presentation on grammar. We will start by covering grammar concepts like different parts of speech and syntax, and then shift over to practicing the skills we need to edit grammar in our transcriptions. There will be some sports metaphors, but that's about as physical as this boot camp is going to get, since the muscle we're really working here is our brain. Grammar is a set of conventions and rules that govern or regulate language and are context dependent, meaning words can play different roles in how they affect language. We'll explore different roles in the parts of speech section. Um, for formal writing, we'll be using standard British or American grammar conventions, which can differ from other English grammar systems that do exist. This doesn't make that the only proper kind of grammar, because really any set of rules can be considered proper grammar as long as they're consistent. Since we are creating legal medical records, though, we're going to be applying very formal rules. A quick note on priorities before we dive in. When it comes to self-assessing what areas we need to improve on in our work, we do want to make sure that we have our major bases covered first. So if you're in the beginning chapters of the course, then this is a good time to be reviewing your grammar skills while you're building up your listening and basic editing and proofreading skills. When you get into the account specifics at the body as a whole chapter, it'll help to focus on those protocols and devote some more mental attention to them. And then past that point, you will be going into specialty chapters, and the highest priority there should be on medical terminology. While grammar and punctuation are important fundamental skills, they won't affect the report nearly as much as mixing up medical terms or lab values. Some protocol failure and other major errors can be caused by underdeveloped grammar muscles, though, so we will be including some exercises for those. Parts of speech are categories of words that have similar grammatical properties. Every word is a part of speech, and each word plays a specific role in the structure of each sentence. One thing that will really help your understanding of grammar is to know it has more to do with structure and roles than it does meaning. So the form and placement of words can change how a sentence is structured without changing its underlying meaning. If I take a simple sentence like, the players were tired after their game, and change things around to say, playing the game left them very tired, you still get the meaning, even though I switch the subjects and actions around a bit. There's a movie line that always cracks me up. After a string of curse words, how the bleep did you bleeping bleeps bleep this bleeping bleep? Another character responds, well, it certainly illustrates the diversity of the word. So this might be a slightly juvenile example, but it does help to illustrate an important side of grammar, that words can and often do change their roles. Similar to the way a player might normally be in a forward or scoring position, but have to play a bit of defense given the situation, the same word can function as a noun, verb, modifier, or even part of a prepositional phrase, though prepositions themselves usually don't change. They're more like goalies. Let's take a slightly more appropriate word, truck. Now, most of us would think of this as a noun. I have a red truck. But it can also function as a verb. It was trucked in yesterday. You could say it was delivered, but this has slightly different implications. And this is how language evolves. We had a word with the correct form, but not the perfect meaning. So we apply the form by changing the placement and suffix, an ed ending made into a past tense verb, to get the meaning we want. We can also change its role by changing its placement. It can become a modifier by putting it in front of a noun, bed. You'll see a lot of different places that will take about 4 or 8 or even more categories of words, but I like to make these 3 simple ones. Subjects and predicates, the verb part, form the basic units of a sentence. Much like all you really need to play soccer is a ball and some energy, all you need for a sentence is a subject and a verb. But we can use pronouns, conjunctions, and prepositions to glue parts of different speech together. And then modifiers like articles, adjectives, and adverbs add some nice glitter to the sentence, which is where I get my glue and glitter. So let's take a look at each of these groups a little bit more. When you think noun, think name. It can name a person, place, concept, or object. Many different types of nouns exist, including proper and common nouns, collective nouns, mass nouns, and they can either be plural or singular, even with collective and mass nouns. Proper nouns will often be for people or places, so most common nouns that are, or common nouns that you see will still be named after someone or some place, as in the case of a lot of ethics or philosophies named after people, or political systems, I guess. And with certain objects, you'll often see them named after places where they came from. So generally, collective nouns are things like groups of families or committees. They're a special subset of count nouns because we generally treat them even though it's talking about a group, we treat it as singular when you're talking about a committee. But again, they can be plural, as in the case of many committees. Mass nouns are often used for things like liquids, powders, or other substances. So if you think water, juice, sugar, sand, metal, wood, you would say, I drank a lot of water, rather than waters, unless you were trying to say that you tried many different types of water. Both collective and mass nouns can be considered singular even when they're being used to describe that many mass or group things, in the case of my team, but you can have groups upon groups. So even if it's a collective or a mass, you can have masses of masses or collections of collectives. A noun is a member of a large open linguistic group, and its members can happen anywhere in the sentence, not just the subject. So the most common one we'll see them role we'll see them playing is as the main word in a subject of a clause, as with the patient will return. So the patient is my subject there. They can also be the object of a verb or the object of a preposition, as with here, who did she see? Her GP. And where was the fracture? On the radius. So when we say it's the object of the preposition, it's explaining where exactly, because that preposition is indicating a where with on. And then as the object of a verb, it's telling us who this person saw. So indicating those roles and relationships. With pronouns, these are the words we substitute for specific nouns when the reader or listener knows which specific noun you're already referring to. If I just said she's going to be late because she's still with her last patient, without any context, you might not know who I was talking about, right? If instead I said Dr. Smith is going to be late because Dr. Smith is still with Dr. Smith's last patient, you might think I was a little mad at Dr. Smith, right? It's a bit odd. So we have this nice in-between. Dr. Smith is going to be late because she is still with her last patient. We know who we're talking about. And if I switch the placement of Dr. Smith around, again, you could reintroduce that uncertainty as to who is doing what. If I said she's going to be late because Dr. Smith is still with her last patient, Dr. Smith could be a whole separate doctor. Or she's going to be late because she's still with Dr. Smith's last patient, could mean that Dr. Smith didn't show up and this other person is now seeing the patient. So, you know, we want to be careful about the placement to make sure we're giving the right context when it comes to pronouns. For articles, we use these to help introduce nouns. They can be definite or indefinite. The type of article we use really depends on how specific we need to be about the thing we're discussing. So a definite article describes one specific noun, which we see all the time in reports where the patient refers to the person the report is about. If we said a patient instead, the implication that's the patient from the report is now gone, and it's making a much more general statement. Choosing which article to use, if any, is with a noun is or can be more of a complex matter depending on whether the noun in question is count or non-count. So uncountable nouns like tachypnea, and this is kind of getting back to that mass or collective thing I was talking about earlier as well, but things like tachypnea, vomiting, or evidence never really take indefinite articles like You could say the tachypnea, though, using the definite article. Some mass nouns we talked about earlier also don't usually take any articles unless you're referring to something already mentioned or something specific. So you would normally say something like, she will drink water. If you said she will drink the water, now it's implying that there's maybe a specific recommendation or type of water that someone should be drinking. And it raises a bit of a question as to what the is representing there. Verbs are words that describe specific actions like running, winning, being something. They can also refer to feelings or states of being, like to love, to be, and those are known as non-action verbs. A verb can agree with the person, gender, or number of some of its arguments, so subject or object that we talked about earlier with nouns. We'll be doing a few subject-verb agreement exercises in a bit to kind of demonstrate this a bit more. But sometimes verbs will combine together, and the verb that helps indicate the tense, but not the actual action carried out, is called the helper verb. And this creates different tenses. So we have three main tenses: present for when an action is being carried out right now, past that has been done, future to indicate that it will be done. But there's also four types that we can apply to those that change some of the implications. So I was seeing the patient denotes that you had this prior relationship that's a little bit different than I saw the patient. It implies that there was something going on that was a bit more continuous, progressive, that maybe stopped at some point. Or if you really want to make it clear, I had been seeing the patient really implies that there was this continuous relationship that's now over. In linguistics, a modifier is an optional element that modifies the meaning of another element. So one of the easiest ways to know if you're dealing with an adjective or adverb is that you can take it out of the sentence without losing anything that helps the sentence make sense. You're just losing a detail. So our two main types are adjectives and adverbs. Adjectives only ever modify nouns, whereas adverbs can modify verbs, verbs, adjectives, and other adverbs. So never nouns, but those other three. And adverbs can also sometimes modify whole phrases, like when you have one right at the beginning of the sentence. When we have multiple adjectives, there's actually something called the royal adjective order. And this order goes by observation, physical descriptions, origin, material, and qualifiers. And it's the reason why the sentence above sounds a lot better than my Italian beautiful wedding silver antique little spoon, which honestly hurt me a bit to say. So adjectives from different groups don't need to be separated by commas, but if you have multiples from the same group, they would. For adverbs, we're often looking at them ending in ly when they modify verbs, but they can also look more like adjectives, like very or fast, when they're modifying adjectives or other adverbs. In the case of things like it's a very fast car, now your fast is modifying car, it's acting as the adjective, very is modifying that adjective, or here we have quickly is an adverb describing drove, but very is modifying that adverb. So we can stack them pretty high. Prepositions will tell you the relationship between the other words in a sentence. It's even baked into the word a bit, pre and position, which indicate time and space. They can also mark various semantic roles, like of and for, get those up, which glue words together to help create relationships. A conjunction is a part of a speech that connects words and phrases or clauses together. So prepositions and conjunctions can actually switch roles depending on the sentence. For example, he hasn't arrived yet. Yet is acting as a conjunction in there, but if I said he left yet his memory remains, now it's acting more as a preposition. So the conjunctions we're going to see the most often have this fun little mnemonic of fanboys to help you remember them by, and those are the ones that we're mainly looking out for when it comes to adding the comma before another independent clause. For our first little exercise, I just want to go through a couple really simple sentences and try and identify the parts of speech we have here. So it's not always easy to identify depending, but there are some little tricks that can make it a bit easier. If you can swap out the noun, if you can swap the word out for a noun and the sentence still makes sense, it's a pronoun usually. If you change the tense and the word you're looking at needs to change to make it happen at a different time, then we know it's we're looking at a verb there. If we can take out the word and the sentence still makes sense, but we lose a little detail, then we know it's an adjective. And then most words ending in ly will be adverbs, but again, the main thing is looking at roles and relationships. If we take out the word and it raises a question, then we're often looking at prepositions since they tell us those whens and wheres. So to start with, I'm just going to grab a pen that'll show up on here. Looking for the subjects. So in this sentence, I find it a bit easier to start with the verbs because we know that it's a bit easier to make those subject-verb connections from there. I don't know, maybe that's just me, but so in the sentence, we have two things that are being described in terms of actions, and had would be one of the main ones, and then looked is what's happening here. If I look at the next one, was brought. So if I change the time of any of this, then I would have to change had to will have, or will look, or will be brought, right? Those will all have to change. If we're going to look at some nouns, so who looked and had the apgars? It's the baby here in question, right? And we have another noun in the form of an object. So had what? And that's going to be apgar. So same thing later on. Oh, and I did miss a verb here because this baby was also flaring. Was flaring. We have a helper verb over here for that. So coming back to was flaring what? His nostrils, right? So we have those objects in that one. And then in this prepositional phrase, we have another object noun, which is where the baby was brought, and is going to be monitored for status and sugars. So we have defining those, there's another relationship here. We have blood, sugars is modifying that. So we know we have a couple adjectives here that are changing that. Up here we have another adjective that's kind of out of place. Or actually, sorry, I'm just skipping ahead. That's technically acting as an adverb there because it's modifying how the baby looked. But while we're on modifiers, why don't we get those adverbs in there? So we also have another adverb here with that ly, and it's changing how, since we have two verbs, it's kind of telling us when this baby was flaring occasionally. And then we have closely changing the this other verb that I left behind, which is being monitored. So that's our, I think that's it for so I'm going to go through and grab some prepositions too, because those can also help make relationships more clear. So we have, if we're looking for these time and space relationships, by is going to tell us what time this is happening in. So we have by 10 minutes acting as a prepositional phrase, and 10 and minutes are acting as the adjective and also noun part of this prepositional phrase. And sorry for my writing, I'm using a mouse. So we also have this preposition here indicating the relationship of what the APGAR score was there. And then 2 is introducing this other prepositional phrase that's telling us where he was brought. And we have a article, those definite articles, and that noun acting as part of that prepositional phrase. And then another relationship that's being drawn here is for what? Respiratory status and blood sugars. We have a bunch of conjunctions in here creating some relationships. So we have this and connecting these two things that will be monitored. We have this one connecting, oh dear, we're connecting the what the baby has in terms of APGARs to looking good. And then we have this other one joining up this other condition that we're describing in the sentence. And then we also have some articles here that are introducing our nouns, like the baby, an APGAR, his nostrils, he. Again, we've already contextualized by saying the baby, so we can draw that relationship down here in this sentence, and we know what's relating to what and who we're talking about. And that's it. I think I just missed that one preposition here. So the main thing, again, when you're trying to identify these, looking at the roles between things really does help, just to identify what part or what a word is doing in a sentence. And again, we could scramble this all up and change things around, like it would sound really weird, but or more commonly, you could have respiratory status and blood sugars were monitored closely in the NICU. That would be changing our subject and kind of eliminating some information here, but is a way of rearranging it that keeps the meaning but changes all the roles. When it comes to agreement, we want to ask how many things the verb really applies to. And for that, we need to make sure that the verb is connected to the right subject. For the first one, she is singular. And because English is really nice and confusing, especially if you come from a French background, it's going to be the begins here that we want to um, use as the verb form that agrees. And saying these out loud both ways can help whenever you're trying to resolve a conflict. So after this, she begin to feel headache. After this, she begins to feel headache. If you are familiar with English, then one of these will sound a bit more familiar and a bit more natural. Anytime there's a question raised in your mind, it's a good thing to go and just check on that, because if you've been speaking English and hearing it, you will kind of pick out when something sounds a bit off. So sometimes it can get trickier when we have things interrupting, like in this case with the skin on the fingers is red, the skin on the fingers are red. Okay, so we have a plural here, but this is a prepositional phrase. So if we took this out entirely and just connect this to this, then we'd want is, because we're dealing with skin, which is singular. When we have two things like the chest and abdomen, I think sometimes it helps me personally to just think of it as, okay, two things were prepped and draped, right? You have one and two, and you can replace it. And if I say two things were prepped and draped, it makes more sense. So that can help with lists. With some things like neither the patient nor I was able to recall, were able to recall, this gets a bit trickier, and really the general rules are that two subjects that are joined by or, either or neither nor, or also not only but also, we treat as singular subjects and give them singular verbs. So neither the patient nor I was able to recall. Either mom or dad was present. Nobody knows what the outcome will be. We treat all of these as singular, even though this is a big group that actually technically equals 0, right? Same with this one. You could replace that with no one was able to recall, and that would make sense. Or no one was present. Or only, sorry, in the case of either or, only one parent was present, right? That's one way to kind of suss out that number. But with a lot of situations that I've found like this where I have questions, I generally use Google for any questions like that, like some indefinite pronouns like nobody, everybody, anyone. If you're wondering about it, just typing in anybody was present or anybody were present into Google will usually give you some results to help suss that out. But you can also try and replace it with something that has the same general meaning. So choosing the correct article here, or no article, we're going to go through and think about the amount and whether we consider it more of a collective or a mass. So he had a vomiting. To me, kind of sounds like it's starting off a really bad Gothic poem. I don't know. So he had the vomiting, or even he had vomiting after drinking would work, right? So I would say the or no article here would work. After drinking only a water could work, because a bottle of water or a glass of water is something you would say. After drinking only the water sounds kind of specific. So to me, the sentence makes the most sense if we just go, he had vomiting after drinking only water, because it's kind of more in line with the general statement that a doctor would make. But if a doctor does say he had the vomiting after drinking only water, that would be fine. And if you're having trouble, a lot of this kind of exercise helps when you hear or the sound, and you're not quite sure if it's or the. Again, at the end of the day, it's not going to change the report too much in terms of meaning, but it's a good question to ask yourself, are they talking about something specific or something general? So if they're just talking about general, then he had vomit after drinking only water. Makes a lot of sense. She had the nausea again this morning. She had a nausea again this morning. So again, doesn't make as much sense there, but the nausea would make sense if they were talking about something that happens recursively and has been described already. The tachypnea was observed on the exam, or a tachypnea was observed. So again, we don't usually use indefinite articles with these kinds of uncount nouns or no count nouns, you'll hear them called. You'll hear doctors just drop articles in front of the a lot. So if you hear was observed on exam, that's totally fine. If you do hear some sort of sound there, it's usually not going to be an exam because they're usually talking about the specific one to the report. Something like they didn't believe they needed to cut down on the sugar intake. A sugar intake sounds like it's just one time they're eating sugar, right? So that wouldn't really make sense for if they're trying to cut down on total intake. So again, the or nothing works best here. Until they saw the evidence or evidence, well, no, it should be an evidence. Oops. Either way, but either way, we're not going to use an evidence because we don't like that indefinite article there. The evidence does make a lot more sense because we're talking about something specific here where they didn't think they needed to do something until they saw something that proved that to the contrary. So we are kind of dealing with something more specific in that case. With Latin irregular forms, so sclera and sclerae, this is kind of one of the simpler ending forms that you'll see a bunch. We just tack a little E on there to make some of these A endings plural. But then we have some irregular forms like adnexa, which is actually supposed to be adnexa uteri. So it's actually technically an adjective. And so you'll never see this ending tacked on. It's always just going to be adnexa. Similarly, quadricep is also not a plural form with the S. In Latin, you have it modifying musculus, so quadriceps musculus would be the full name. And the plural of it is actually quadricipides. So in English, we just use quadriceps because I think everyone collectively decided that quadricipides was not going to happen. So we use quadriceps for plural or singular if we're talking about just the one on the left, like in here. Same actually goes for biceps, which the technical plural is bicipides, and triceps, which would be tricepses. So all fun words to say. There's a bunch of other irregular forms. So another A ending that, or sorry, this one switched around. This is the singular ending. But if we're dealing with a plural, we want multiple diverticula. So not this. And you can find a lot of these in the Book of Style and also in the course material. It can really help to print out some of those tables if you do find you struggle with some of the Latin endings, or put them into a word list, any system that is easy for you to reference while you're working. So syntax comes from the ancient Greek for coordination or ordering together. And really this dictates how words from different parts of speech are put together in order to convey a complete thought. So the main concerns we're looking at are going to include word order, grammatical relations, hierarchical sentence structure, agreement, and the relationship between form and meaning. And this really distills down into the difference between phrases, sentences, and clauses are one of the big areas of syntax. So phrases are words that are grouped together that don't have a subject or verb to form a phrase. We already dealt with a few of these with some of the noun phrases or prepositional phrases, like to the store is a prepositional phrase. It can't stand on its own because it doesn't have that subject or verb. And something like even that stands on its own would be considered a prepositional phrase. So you might hear verb phrase, adjective phrase, other things like that. It's just referring to the group of words that kind of is glued together by that preposition or verb or noun or adjective, whatever it is. Phrases can be really short or they can be really long. The degree to which we have seen the effects of this medication on the number to treat, that is, the number to take this medication before any curative outcome is achieved, is a really long-winded phrase, but leaves a hanging question. The degree to which is what, right? It's not a complete thought. It doesn't finish. So a clause is a combination of a predicate, so usually the part of the sentence containing the verb and stating something about the subject, and its arguments and modifiers. So clauses can have both subjects and predicates, like independent clauses, which we'll talk about a bit more in a second. But unlike phrases, a clause can sometimes act as a sentence, and that's the independent clause, but that's not always the case. Sometimes it's a dependent clause, or a subordinate clause is also called as well. And they need to be combined with an independent clause to complete the meaning. So a sentence is a clause that's not part of another clause, which is kind of the opposite way of saying what I just said about dependent clauses. So a complete sentence has a subject and a predicate and can be composed of more than one clause, with independent and a dependent clause. But as long as it has a subject and predicate, a group of words can form a sentence no matter how short it is. I shop is a short sentence, but it contains both subject and predicate. So it's a complete thought. So an independent clause is a group of words that has subject and verb and expresses a complete thought. It can stand on its own and is also considered a sentence. An independent clause, a dependent clause is any group of words that has a subject and verb but doesn't express a complete thought. So a dependent clause can't be a sentence. And often it's marked off by dependent marker words, like after, although, as if, because, before, even if, even though, if, in order to, since, though, unless, until, whatever, when, whenever, whether. And a dependent clause will need to tack on to dependent onto an independent to make a complete sentence that can stand on its own. So you can combine those with a comma and a coordinating conjunction, or with a semicolon. And a complex sentence has at least one independent clause and at least one dependent, so that's the combination of those two. Dependent clauses can refer to the subject with who or which, the sequence or time, since or while, or causal elements like because, if, of the independent clause. So what that means in plain English is if you have an independent clause like I went to the mall, comma, because I like to shop. You don't even need that comma actually. Because I like to shop is a dependent clause that refers causally to that. Why did you go to the mall? Because this. So that comma wouldn't need to be there unless I shifted over that dependent clause and said something like because I like to shop, I went to the mall. Now we need that comma because it should technically be separated. Sentence types, sentence types can also be combined. So a compound complex sentence has at least 2 independent clauses and at least 1 dependent clause. And you will see those a lot with doctors and medicine. So the subject of the sentence is what or whom the sentence is about. The predicate is the part of a sentence or a clause that tells what the subject is doing or what the subject is. So subject is usually going to be a noun or a pronoun-based part of the sentence, and the predicate is usually going to be the verb-based part of the sentence. And to identify each part, we can ask ourselves 2 really simple questions: who and what. So the patient was sick. So who was sick? The patient. Was what? Was sick. So obviously really simple example, but if we have something more complex, like this here, is that telling us a who, or is it telling us more of a when? So if it's telling us more of a when, we can tell that it's a bit more of a preposition. And so then who is still the patient here. And what did they do? They called to report their feelings. So playing a little bit of journalistic 5 W's can really help identify these rules. The who, what, when, where, why can really help, especially who and what for these. So as I mentioned earlier, there are some major and account-specific errors that have grammar as a root cause. And being able to identify the role a word is playing can help us with the classic follow-up error, whether to spell out numerals and ordinals, capitalization and possession with eponyms, whether to capitalize departments and specialties. We can also do some exercises here for making subject-verb agreement happen again. And I'm going to take more medically related examples for that. And also just connecting subjects to verbs to help with headings and subheadings. And finally, we'll just do a little practice with expanding contractions. That'll be the cool down. So there are 3 different ways we can write follow up, but I'm just going to cut it down to 2, since most style guides do recommend dropping the hyphen now. And with that out of the way, the simplest rule for follow-up is that we only ever break it into 2 words when it functions as a verb. So to check if this is the case, we can try changing the tense of the sentence. So with this, if I want to change this to yesterday, then I would say the patient came in for a follow-up appointment yesterday. And the part of the sentence that has to change there is this. So I know that follow-up can just stay as is and not get broken up at all. If I want to change this to last month, I would say he did have a follow-up with me last month, right? So again, follow-up can stay the way it is, can keep that connection. If I want to say next week, she will follow up with me next week. Or let's make it present tense, and because I just want to use that to show something. So if we say she is following up with me this week, if I want to change that to this, then what I have to change here is this helper verb, and I have to tack on an ending here. So I want that space to be there to tack in that ending. So even if I'm not changing the sentence, I know I want that space in there in case I have to change the tense when follow-up is the verb part of the sentence. For things like spelling out the number 1 when we use it as a noun or pronoun, or zeros as general expressions, or first versus first, again, we have to look at identifying the role. So The first patient was late. It's just acting to modify patient, and so we know it's acting as a adjective that is enumerating which patient in which order. She was seen first. What this is modifying now is who was seen when. And first is kind of a hard, one of the trickier ones when it comes to ordinals for us, because one of the shifts in language is people really started dropping the ly when it comes to first, because it sounds really formal. She was seen firstly. Sounds a little too posh for most of us now. Or I will firstly prep and drape the patient. Sounds, but I first prepped and draped the patient. Sounds more natural and organic. So in this case, because the ly should be there, then we don't, we know it's acting as an adverb, and we want to spell it out in the case of first versus first. So with one or one, we can kind of reverse that pronoun test that we talked about earlier. So trying to test for whether something is acting as a pronoun, if we replace it with a noun, we can tell that that's what it's doing. So he's normally a person to hide his symptoms would work in this sentence, right? So we know that one is the form we're looking at using here. Whereas if I look at she has one older sibling, if I try and replace that with a noun, she has a person older sibling, sounds a bit clunky and a little bit weird. But if I replace this with another number, like she has 10 older siblings, big family, it still works. So here we know that we're dealing with one, again, as a count adjective that's helping us know how many siblings there are. There was zero evidence this treatment worked. If you, again, change the number, or if you wanted to try, let's say, changing to another adjective, like there was good evidence this treatment worked, that can help suss out whether we want to spell out zero versus keep it as a numeral. So in this case, there was good evidence this treatment works sounds a lot better than there were two evidences that this treatment worked. So we're going to keep it spelled out. Whereas we used a 0-degree scope, you could put a 180-degree scope, and that would make more sense. So we know it's acting as a countable adjective here. Now for eponyms, words named after a person, we do want to take a look at the role it's playing. So if we had, when we talk about adjectival roles with eponyms, it's basically taking that base word and changing it into either an adjective, or sometimes it's making it into a verb. So with Parkinsonism, we're usually looking at it would just end without this tacked on. And so we know that this is in the adjectival role, and we would have this all in lowercase. No capitals. With Crohn's here, it's not being changed. The ending isn't being changed for it. So we know we're actually referring to Crohn's disease in the noun form. And I can really draw well with the mouse. But because disease isn't here, we tend to we'll use the apostrophe s to imply it, essentially. And because it's not being changed into an adjective or a verb, it's acting as a noun, we want to keep this uppercase. In this example, the wound was bovied. We actually have this nice helper verb here telling us that it is a verb form, and also the ed ending is helping the past tense as well. So this would be all lowercase when we type it out. Nunsney is a fun term I've learned, and kind of coming back to something we were talking about earlier with proper versus common nouns. If the easiest difference between proper and common nouns is proper noun is referring to one specific thing, like Dr. Smith, and common nouns are referring to, could be any. So doctors in general, or doctor could be any doctor. This does help us with if we're trying to figure out if something might be an eponym. Although again, Google's going to be your friend there, so don't be afraid of it. And if you look up Nunsney, it is lowercase because it's just it's similar to tennis elbow or a golfer's elbow. We're not talking about a specific golfer if we say golfer's elbow, so we keep it lowercase. It's just referring to the profession, so I'll be all lower. And then Alzheimer's, again, we don't have that disease following here, so we would keep in this apostrophe s to kind of imply it, but we would also keep this uppercase because it's acting as a noun here. And folate at the end of the procedure, again, we have this nice helper verb was and the ed ending, so we would know that this should be all lower. With departments and specialties, we're also looking at whether we're talking about something specific or general. So the patient was seen in the emergency department, could really be anywhere, right? So we're gonna have that. Sorry, I just can't see my mouse for some reason. We're gonna have that be all lowercase because it could be any emergency department anywhere. Whereas she was brought to the, let's say it was Toronto General operating room. But I did use the scrub marker here just to help. It is something we see commonly enough that people, the scrub marker will kind of confuse you because it doesn't seem like anything proper is introducing this, but it is, but it's just been bleeped out because we're dealing with de-identified reports. So the fact that it was bleeped out is because it's specific. And so we know that, I apologize for my bad writing here. We know that this is going to be now part of that proper name, so we want to treat it like a proper name and give it initial capitals. With specialties, we have the personification rule, and this gets a bit tricky in terms of he was seen by orthopedics, doesn't have anything specific introducing it, but it's acting as a person there. And this, in this case, because it's acting as a person, and you could sub in Dr. Smith, which is the usual trick that we talk about. Then we want to treat it like a proper name and use the uppercase. So the one exception to this is if you have something like clinic following, you're going to keep that lowercase because it, even though this technically isn't the right preposition we'd want there, in would be better, but even without correcting that preposition, we are just referring to a place. So it's not really talking about the specialty as a group of people who practice something. It's talking about a specific place where you would go to get this. And sorry, a non-specific place because it's not talking about one that we're introducing with a proper noun. With a fragment, like lungs clear, we can either keep that or break it. There's really no real big difference and of course this is dealing with a subheading, not a heading, but there's really not going to be much of a difference if I put in a colon here. Whereas if you have something like, here we're missing a helper verb of were, but this again has a bit of an area that I would want to make more separate. So using the colon to clarify that these are two subjects, because otherwise it sounds like you're saying abdomen bowel, as in like this is describing this. And really it would be a bit of an odd construction. So vowel sounds heard keeps this more connected to the descriptor, and even though it's a fragment, it makes a bit more sense to separate these two subjects. For subject-verb agreement, there are a few areas of medicine we see a lot of agreement confusion. So doses or units of measure we treat as collective singular nouns, and so they're going to take singular verbs to go with that. 3 milliliters were given to the patient does sound right, and this is where reading things out loud can kind of lead you astray sometimes if you don't know little rules like this. Then 3 milliliters was given to the patient might sound a bit less natural until you consider there's almost a implied dose in between there. So if you think then a 3 milliliter dose was given to the patient, that sounds more natural. But again, we're dealing with a collective, so you can think of it like water, as something that we treat as singular even if it sounds like there's a lot more there than one thing. Sometimes we get these prepositional phrases that interrupt. So of this 30-minute appointment is a prepositional phrase. And if we took this out of it entirely, the things we want to connect here are minutes to the verb were, right? Because it's plural. So anytime you have a preposition like of, to, for, that's really where you kind of want to look for the subject-verb connection, unless the prepositional phrase is the thing that's being talked about. So for this, we have two verbs here. There's the was, were here, and we also have had up here. So even though this is the subject and the verb here, and this is what's connected, it's separated from this, and that's where our comma gives us a nice little separation for things like this. Even though we don't deduct for non-restrictive clause commas, they do kind of help separate things out. So our subject in this non-restrictive clause is actually all. So we don't need to look at labs or even this is technically the subject there, but so all were unremarkable, all was unremarkable, right? Because all is one of those collective nouns, kind of like everyone. And now for our bonus exercise on contractions. We don't use these in medical transcription unless it's in a direct quote. And in that case, we do keep them in. So most of the time, this is going to be pretty straightforward. I didn't do it, said the patient, or I can't take this medication any longer, said the patient, will be your kind of usual contractions that you see. And they're pretty straightforward if you've been using them. The one that tends to confuse people is it's and its. And, you know, there's good reason for that. We use the possessive apostrophe s everywhere except this one case where it flips around. So its is the contraction of it is. And that's what we're looking at in this first example here. If you expanded that, it is going to be fine, makes more sense. But because it's in a quote, we're going to leave it like it is. Whereas here, if we expanded it to she researched it is effectiveness, it kind of sounds a little tongue trippy and doesn't make sense anymore. So we want the possessive. And for possession here, we don't use the apostrophe S. And it's one of those things with English is there are exceptions to almost every rule. This is the one for this rule. So if there's anything you can take away from this, it's that really we all tend to get a bit rusty with our grammar skills, considering when we learn most of those rules. But like any skill set in your MT toolbox, it can be honed through practice. The more you practice, the more you can use proper grammar without having to stop and think about it. And that frees up more of your mental RAM for other MT skills. One final confession that I'm going to make is that I still double check grammar rules all the time. And maybe that's because I still second guess myself even after years of being an MT. And, but I also have an interest in grammar. I like seeing some of these rules because it's interesting. Grammar is this interesting thing where we're trying to apply a set of rules onto something that's constantly evolving and shifting. But if you try and keep in mind that at the end of the day, what you're looking for are roles and relationships, that can really help guide you through a lot of things. And for everything else, don't be afraid to look it up. Ask Google. It's super helpful. Grammarly is another great site. And it's good to look at their explanations because those might stick. I used to have a bit more trouble with things like always versus always or everyday versus everyday, whether it's one word or two. And looking up those definitions definitely helps to help that stick into my brain and make me not have to think about it. And doing that will help you in that if you don't have to think about it and you do it a bit more naturally, you can look at more other parts of the report while you're working. So practice, 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 and don't be afraid to Google things. Some resources I've found really helpful myself have been the Khan Academy's grammar module. It's really nicely broken up. The lessons and exercises are delivered in nice little bite-sized chunks. And they have a lot of video and interactive content. So it's engaging, but also fits really easily into the start of a work or study session. Purdue University also has what they call the Online Writing Lab, and it has a wealth of information you can explore, as well as HDI, which has some workbooks for grammar and usage that you can order if you like the paper versions of things, and marking those all up, which is its own kind of nerdy fun, right? So if you have any extra questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me or anyone else on the instructional team here. We'll also be posting a PDF version to the forum, so stay tuned for that. And thank you once again for joining me and putting up with my terrible scribbles and cat in the background. All right, bye everyone.